destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, August 31st, 2023. My name is Sam Seder. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Samuel Moyn, professor of law and history at Yale University, author of Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals, and the Making of Our Times. Also on the program today, Clarence Thomas finally decides to report his trip paid for billionaire. Also says that he had to take a private jet for security reasons after Dobbs, just like the founders would have wanted. Donald Trump enters a not guilty plea and waives appearing at arraignment in his Georgia case, while the New York Attorney General says that Trump inflated his property values by over $2 billion as part of a giant fraud. What? Speaking of a fraud, America's mayor found liable in a defamation suit by forfeit. Feds say states are kicking off too many children from Medicaid. Biden pledges $95 million for Hawaii electrical grid. Meanwhile, FEMA says they are pulling back their resources because their funds are depleted, and Congress is dragging its feet in replenishing those funds. Welcome to the new age of climate change. HUD releases new aid to help with low-income rent. Alabama Attorney General says he can prosecute people who help people travel for out-of-state abortions. A Texas judge says a law pushed by Greg Abbott to override local ordinances is unconstitutional. And the Proud Boys, they're going to get their sentencing, it turns out, next week. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us. It is a Emma Majority Report with Sam Seder Day today. Emma is out and I am here. We're going to be talking to Samuel Moyn. A little intellectual history, but also maybe where liberalism has gone wayward. And we will get to that in a moment. But first, we played this clip. It came up during the show yesterday. Mitch McConnell giving an address to, some type of press conference. And he had another moment where he froze. Now, obviously, like I've been complaining for quite a while, the geriatric nature of our politicians, particularly the Democrats. Frankly, I don't care how old or infirm Republican politicians are. If they were all in a coma, I'd be happier. I'm not going to play that clip of Mitch McConnell again, but it's interesting. Here's Laura Ingraham talking about this. The politics around this are really interesting, not just in terms of the election, but recall, now I am not convinced 100% of this, because Democrats would have to change the rules, and it's unclear as to whether Manchin and Sinema would vote to override the parliamentarian to change the rules, et cetera, et cetera. If Dianne Feinstein resigned and vacated her seat on the judiciary, the claim has been there is no way to replace her there. Now, it is very difficult to figure out, frankly, from where I sit, and I've talked to many people who have given me different answers as to whether the Democrats could replace her. It would involve one of those things like the nuclear option type of thing that, we've seen it with bills. I'm not sure that we couldn't see it with the organizing rules of the Senate. But with all that in mind, here's Laura Ingraham complaining about Mitch McConnell.
But Republicans can't Feinstein McConnell. In other words, let him continue on like this. It's cruel, and it also negates their ability to make Biden's own decrepit state an issue in 2024. And by the way, whomever the GOP Senate chooses to replace McConnell should not be his establishment understudy. Instead, he or she should reflect the majority views of the party on China, on the border, on the deep state, the need to reform it, Ukraine, and trade. As I said the other night, we've already won the debate on the big issues in the GOP, and there's no going back to 2005, kids. Joining me now.
I'm not sure I fully understand at all what she's talking about.
Who's this hidden for?
I don't know if she's trying to get Rick Scott in there. I mean, I guess back in 2005, Rick Scott was actually performing Medicaid fraud. So it's hard to assess. Nevertheless, and we should say, it's not so much that the Republicans are Feinsteining or that the Democrats are Feinsteining the Feinstein. I mean, the reason why they're holding back is because of threats from Republicans, from Mitch McConnell, that he would not allow a replacement on the Judiciary Committee. But leave aside the sort of the implicit lies there. We could be getting into a situation, because presumably if McConnell has to resign, then they're going to need someone's going to step into his role, and it's unclear as to whether they could hold their positions on their committees. They probably could, but surely, the implications of missing one person on a committee, or that person not being able to show up at the committee so much because they have to do leadership jobs. There may be sort of like one of those, we'll trade our hostage for your hostage type of situation. I haven't seen anybody write about this yet, but I would imagine there's going to be some talk around this. The other thing is that Mitch McConnell was determined this time around to get good Senate candidates because he wanted to retake the Senate. Remember last time it was Rick Scott, and Rick Scott, just recruited a bunch of loonies. Their Senate recruiting has been better this time around, but it is unclear where support will go in the absence of Mitch McConnell if there's a different leadership in the Senate. And Blake Masters is going to jump into the race in Arizona. I don't know who
versus Kerry.
I don't know which one is better or worse, frankly, for Gallego. But nevertheless, that's an issue going into this election. It's also an issue because in a month, there's going to be a big fight over the budget. Now, McConnell doesn't have as much say in that because it ends up into the heads to the Senate. But this is, McConnell is probably the best strategist they have, and certainly been the best, Republican leader in the Senate in my lifetime. He was able to get 200 plus horrible judges sitting on the bench. He was the one who orchestrated the takeover of the Supreme Court. And I just don't know if there's anybody else in the Republican caucus who's going to be able to sort of like have that level of savvy.
Hope not.
But, I mean, I don't want to wish ill on any specific individual person. So let me just wish ill on the entire Republican caucus in the Senate and hope that it's distributed in a way that is effective.
Put it on 7.
Yep. We're going to take a break and hear from our sponsor in a moment. And then we'll be talking to Samuel Moyn, professor of law and history at Yale University, author of Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals, and the Making of Our Times. But first, a message from Stamps.com. What would you call that? A service? A service that I've used that many times when I've had, like, there's an ebb and flow when I've got to send a lot of stuff out. It's a little bit ebbier around my house these days because my unofficial reselling of clothes business that was run by my daughter has closed shop, at least locally. But Stamps.com has been helping businesses like yours, and at times mine, save time and money for 25 years. And September, I know it, I hate to say it, but we're good. You're ramping up. If you're in retail, you're ramping up for holidays. Stamps.com is your own personal post office. Doesn't matter where you are. With Stamps.com, all you need is a computer and a printer. They'll even send you a free scale, so you have everything you need to print postage at 2 in the morning, at 8 a.m., 12 p.m., 5 p.m., like you get it, 24/7, 365. And now taking care of orders on the go is even easier with Stamps.com mobile app. If you need a package pickup, you can easily schedule it through your Stamps.com dashboard. And if you sell products online, Stamps.com, of course, seamlessly connects with every major marketplace and shopping cart. So super easy to generate those labels and send them out with Stamps.com. You get premium discounts and supplies. They're all there right on your fingertips at that dashboard. If you're running low, you order shipping and mailing supplies, you get labels, even printers if you need it, from their supply store. And you get huge carrier discounts. 84% off U.S. Postal Service and UPS rates. That obviously, who doesn't want a discount? Stamps.com, for 25 years, has been indispensable for over 1 million businesses. Get access to the USPS and UPS services you need right now from your computer, like I say, anytime, day or night. No lines, no traffic, no waiting, no going outside. Just get it all done. I used Stamps.com back in the day. We were sending out the DVDs for memberships back in the early days. Back when people had DVDs.
What do I do with this?
Exactly. Now you use them, you hang them in your garden to scare off birds. Anyways, Stamps got super easy. They'll send you everything you need. You can sign up with promo code Majority Report for a special offer. It includes a 4-week trial, plus they give you some free postage, plus they give you a free digital scale. There are no long-term commitments. There are no contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, enter the code Majority Report. Stamps.com, promo code Majority Report. All right, quick break. When we come back, Samuel Moyn, professor of law and history at Yale University, author of Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals, and the Making of Our Times. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Samuel Moyn. He is professor of law and history at Yale University, author of Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals, and the Making of Our Times. Professor, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So you're going to have to walk me through some of this. Intellectual history, I've done a little bit, not as much as some other things. But let's just start with define for us liberalism as it, maybe from its genesis. I mean, I know you're talking about its departure from sort of, maybe 19th century and maybe early 20th century, but just give us a brief sort of history, if you will, of where it came out of the Enlightenment, what it was about when we say liberalism, at that time.
Yeah, so if you went to college in recent decades, you probably were taught that liberalism came out of early modern religious wars, and John Locke was its founder. But we now think that liberalism, especially when people began to call themselves liberals, really comes out of the French Revolution. So it's a lot newer than many people think. And when it came out of the French Revolution, it's championed by a group of people and later by parties and eventually by Americans who only start calling themselves liberals in large numbers after World War I as an emancipatory creed. It's about realizing the promise of the French Revolution, overthrowing aristocrats and kings, and giving people the wherewithal to launch themselves. And it's about kind of looking to the future with hope. And I basically claim that all changed in the middle of the 20th century.
And just to speak a little bit more about this sort of emancipatory nature. I mean, how tied into it is the idea of democracy, or is democracy sort of a product of liberal thinking? The idea that we don't have to, that God doesn't get to dictate how we operate necessarily on earth by appointing a king and them having, soldiers to make sure that we stay in line.
There are very deep connections and certainly, it is an old idea that triumphs in the American Revolution before the French one, that, the basis of politics is popular sovereignty. The people are the foundation of political authority. But the trouble is that was still compatible with absolute monarchy. That was Thomas Hobbes's argument, for example. And even John Locke, who said you have to consent to your government, said you could overthrow the king, but it would only be for the sake of a new one. So things get really different after the American and French Revolution when you have, commitments to at least more participation in choosing, our leaders, and they can change every so often. Even then, liberals, care a little bit about that, but they mostly care about, other things like this idea of launching every human being. And they actually get nervous about democracy because in the French Revolution, democracy, went south, partly because it had so many enemies. And actually, the first time the phrase liberal democracy is used isn't until the later 19th century. So it's a complicated story, but I would say there are some connections between liberalism and democracy. And yet today, I think most liberals are Democrats. The reverse isn't true. And a lot's at stake then in kind of what liberals are hoping for, what kind of democracies they want to build in the 20th and 21st centuries.
What most exemplifies the liberalism pre-Cold War? Is it is it the four freedoms that FDR talks about, or is it somewhere? I'm trying to get a sense of
Yeah, sure.
a way that we can sort of, I don't want to pre-digest this, but to have it somewhat pre-digested.
Totally. So I just would say it's almost like a moral and spiritual ideal. You can associate it with, college books like John Stuart Mill's On Liberty or Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And Franklin Roosevelt, who gave the Four Freedoms speech, inherits a lot of that and understands that economics matter more than those 19th century liberals. But what they all share is that ordinary people get to live lives of their choosing. And it's not about, whether you were born into like the right order or what your last name is because it was your dad's profession and his dad's before that. And indeed, liberals are some of the first feminists, and so they say it's it should matter not whether you're male or female, but who you want to be in life. And then the governmental problem is, how do we set up institutions to allow these emancipated individuals to actually enjoy the freedom they've been promised? And that's where we are today, to be honest.
Okay, so let's talk about like what changed in that formulation. The idea of, and I guess maybe it's best understood as sort of like a dynamic, or a function, because it changes what the answers are to the question of like what's going to be emancipatory at any given time is a function of the context in which we live. And the idea was, at least your argument is that liberalism was this sort of like machine that was going to travel with us through time, that was going to answer this question: what can be most emancipatory? What can make life most fulfilling for human beings in this moment? And then in the Cold War, that changes.
Absolutely. So, it's not that the earlier liberals were perfect, and they bet a lot on markets to emancipate. And as I mentioned earlier, they weren't always full-throated Democrats. But when they saw the Weimar Republic collapse and Adolf Hitler arise, and
I'm sorry, we should say Democrats, just so people know, we're talking small d Democrats.
Yeah, we haven't talked.
We're not talking about political parties here.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, and actually, liberals, refer to, until recently, the Republican Party in the United States, because it's like people who accept constitutions and representative governments and some, set of individual rights. And Republicans and Democrats in America used to bicker about, within the terms of those agreeing about those things. But now we're in a different place. I guess I would say, the middle of the 20th century was outrageous for liberals because they don't see the progress in emancipation that they expect. And indeed, once World War II ends and the Soviet Union has played such a big role in putting Hitler down, the Soviet Union becomes really appealing to a lot of people. It's now claiming to be the vanguard and to represent enlightenment, reason, science, progress. And of course, it says we're the bearers of universal emancipation. And instead of clawing those claims back, liberals sort of give it up, and they say, actually, emancipation is scary. We should be most on guard for the continuity of liberal regimes against totalitarian threats, and define liberalism in terms of freedom from the state, rather than seeing the state as necessary to launch individuals, first of all, through education. They begin to see a state as an encroaching totalitarian threat that has to be kept in strict limits. And that's a betrayal of FDR, who was like the last gasp of the earlier liberalism and did more to expand the state than any liberal in history.
And I mean, how much does this and I want to go through, I mean, you highlight 6 writers as and thinkers as to sort of show the way that this sort of this reversal happens in some respect. How much is it? And I'd like to go through those people, but how much? Sure. What's the relationship? Is it just coincidence? Like, Because when I hear and I know that it's Berlin that talks about these negative freedoms or negative liberty, but how much of what was going on at Mount Pelerin and that sort of strain of libertarianism, how much of that sort of like bled into this, and then it sort of turns out we get these sort of offshoots of weird American libertarianism and then neoliberalism. But talk about that mixture at that time.
Yeah, you're right at the heart of like what I was trying to show. Isaiah Berlin is an Oxford professor, and he actually said some pretty critical things about Friedrich Hayek, who founded the Mont Pelerin Society and really transmitted neoliberalism forward into our time. And yet, if you look at what Berlin wrote, most famously an essay called Two Concepts of Liberty. It's a Cold War tract that says what's most important is individual freedom from non-interference by the state. Well, that's exactly what Hayek wanted. It's just that Berlin, didn't think that his argument would apply to redistributive acts of, taxation and transfer by states. And yet, I would argue that he set up a time bomb because, at the very moment FDR's state is, taxing so much, Dwight Eisenhower is taxing at the rate of over 90% on the wealthiest Americans, highest marginal tax rate. The Cold War liberals are saying, no, it's all about freedom from the state. That's what's going to win the Cold War against the totalitarian foe. And so in a way, the welfare state, which is being built in the middle of the 20th century, is left without a theoretical defense. The theoretical defense seems a lot closer to neoliberalism than maybe Berlin meant. And then there was kind of, I believe it would be fair to say that those kinds of arguments set up a really good propitious situation for neoliberals to swoop in practice, which happened in the 1970s and 80s through the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and so forth.
This is like it really is fascinating just to see the implications. Well, it's the specifics are fascinating in itself, but the dynamic, the idea that someone could put out this idea and with the best of intentions, and it begin to corrode the foundations for why we have a state that wants to help emancipate people. That's to me why the Four Freedoms really resonated, because part of it seems like it's a little bit of like, I'm going to get into your circle of trust and say, freedom from religion and this and that. But sure, then I'm going to make an affirmative case that the state actually can help develop freedom for people because we have constraints as human beings that the state can help overcome. Like, we don't have to worry about marauding bands of attackers, or you don't have to worry about, rain because we're going to make sure you have shelter. You don't have to worry about famine because we're going to make sure you have food, that type of thing. And you can plant these seeds. I don't know. I know it's asserting blame on someone like Berlin for sort of like helping that project is sort of a silly thing to do, I guess, at this point. But intellectually, it is problematic, right? It adds to this milieu that undercut that concept that government is here for the people.
I think that's totally right. That, it's not about, scapegoating Berlin as if there weren't a lot of capitalists that were trying to, foil the New Deal really from the start and gain a lot of traction after World War II. And yet, they loved Berlin because he was, in a sense, saying in very sophisticated ways what was very useful to them. He failed to oppose them and oppose neoliberals effectively, and it's that he left us kind of speechless. In liberals had no kind of grand defense of what they were actually doing. I mean, even FDR, if we're going to be honest, it's very revealing that the fourth freedom is still freedom from want, doesn't focus on, exactly how that's going to be remedied. I mean, obviously he thinks the state's going to play a major role, but I think FDR was forced by the American situation and just the ingrained libertarianism of American life to kind of cede a lot to libertarianism, even in announcing the four freedoms. And, the history of the Democrats since, there's just tons of that. It's just that they smuggled in some welfare for a while before joining neoliberalism themselves, especially after Jimmy Carter, notably, and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama's administrations.
And I think there's an argument that Jimmy Carter was a couple of steps in that direction himself.
Strong argument,
but
strong argument.
Let's talk about Judith Shklar. Am I pronouncing her name correctly?
Yep.
Where does she fit in? I mean, she starts off, you write, being a much more adamant defender, I should say, of liberalism as it existed pre-World War, and then sort of like begins to sort of, I don't know, retreat from that. Walk us through that. She's probably less famous than some of the others, but she wrote the single most famous defense of Cold War liberalism in, ironically, 1989, called The Liberalism of Fear. And she really defined it as the cause of, doing damage control and, reducing cruelty as the highest liberal aims. And yet, ironically, she had spent her youth criticizing the coming of Cold War liberalism, remembering what liberalism had been always wary of enemies, but always, dedicated to emancipation. And really, her trouble was that after World War II, she's actually the one who argues most strongly that liberals have fallen into cahoots with the neoliberals. She's one of the first critics of neoliberalism back in the 1950s from a liberal perspective. And yet she thought liberals had deprived themselves of the tools to fight neoliberals. And I think she was onto something, and was in a way prophetic, because, of course, Cold War liberalism and the welfare state did end up devolving into our neoliberal world. So she's a really useful witness of what things were like, when it may have been too late, but when the memory of the earlier liberalism was still alive. And what happened?
Well, I think it's tough to live decade after decade. She died only the year after the Cold War formally ended in 1991. And I think that she just, had her hopes as a young person pulverized. A lot of what's at stake there is that, she's a Jew, like almost all the Cold War liberal thinkers, and had been a migrant from Riga, where actually Isaiah Berlin had also been born. And a lot of people have said, well, this is the natural response of a Holocaust survivor to hate the state and, patrol its boundaries. But actually, it's not. None of that can be true, because a lot of Jews were socialist, and she protested the coming of Cold War liberalism before she, joined in with it.
Was it what and we should say, like, what were the sort of other contexts? I mean, the idea is that we're afraid of the Soviet Union and the way that it inhibited freedoms of speech, and it was all the opposite of negative liberty, I guess.
There are a couple of problems. One is that the Soviet Union was tyrannical, but I think the Cold War liberals were even more concerned that it's the promises that the Soviet Union stood for, emancipation and liberation, that turned out to be pretexts that fooled a lot of liberals into signing up for the wrong cause. including domestic socialism, which these Cold War liberals kind of banned from polite company until Bernie Sanders finally brought it back. And I think the Cold War liberals just thought, people were dupes, and the Soviet Union, aside from being tyrannical at home and its global influence, just left too many people kind of with innocence and about what these promises of emancipation could conceal. And so the Cold War liberals said it's better not to hope at all, to give up high aims, including for a liberal state, and instead to guard against the perversion of the state into a tyranny.
All right, well, let's talk about Karl Popper, because
Sure.
he undercuts, I guess, a historicism that explain to us what historicism is in the context of, let's say, Hegel and Marx,
Sure.
but also how that was important relative to liberalism, and what undercutting that did to
Sure.
liberal thought.
No, this is a fantastic question, because it's really at the core of what I was trying to say. So, everyone in the 19th century, it thinks that they're in the course of a history of progress, and they say liberalism, and once socialists come about, socialism is something that will unfold over time. Freedom and equality don't just exist; they have to be brought about over generations. It's kind of the original version of the arc of the moral universe, except it bent towards freedom and emancipation, not justice, in some other sense. And what Popper does is say we really need a form of liberalism that doesn't fall prey to the Soviet Union's claims on the future. Remember, the Soviet Union, again, said we're the agents bringing about what they called the radiant future, and liberals like Popper, who became friends with Hayek, attended the first Montpellier Society meeting, said liberalism needs to avoid that kind of self-orientation, and again, it's for similar reasons that the Soviets fool you into signing up for tyranny instead of the actual emancipation they're promising. But instead of promising their own emancipation, liberals just gave up on it. And so I think Karl Popper was immensely important by criticizing this earlier kind of futuristic form of liberalism, and in the name of one that didn't make promises because it was afraid that the Soviets would claim to realize them itself.
Hannah Arendt. Well, I guess let's go to Gertrude Himmelfarb.
Sure. Sure.
Why include Himmelfarb?
Okay. So just as I argued that Berlin set up Cold War liberalism for a neoliberal outcome, I think it's fair to say that Himmelfarb is interesting because she sets up Cold War liberalism for a neoconservative outcome. She was the wife of Irving Kristol, more famous
Bill Kristol's
as the founder,
mom,
and Bill Kristol's mother. And it turns out that when she was young, she was a Cold War liberal, and she made all the same claims as we've already canvassed, except she makes a kind of additional interesting one, which is that liberals need to get Christianity back and assert it against the Soviets, because if we talk about how sinful human beings are, they won't be tempted to think they can transcend iniquity and dream big and aim high. And she never, came close to flirting with Christianity herself. She was a Jew like all the others, but she propagated a very Christianized Cold War liberalism because this understanding of Christianity, she said, was really useful for liberals. And I think this has been missed. So, she kind of takes her early steps towards neoconservatism, which, drew a lot on Christianity and especially Christian voters in the Reagan Revolution long before in the 1940s. And that's why I included her.
And I also recall that she was one of, I don't know if she was the first, but to suggest, and this is consistent with her promotion of Christianity, that there should be a concerted attack on objective science.
Right.
And does that further that same project in the sense that, like, if we don't accept, I guess, sort of like if we accept that man has the ability to sort of like do things, right, that then we're subject to that problem of like, maybe we can emancipate people. Like, we have more control over our society than. I mean, she wants us to go back to sort of those eras where, like,
totally
God appoints the king, and that's what the
totally
law of nature is.
Totally right. I mean, she really thought that, having authority not in, secular science, but in religious mystery would safeguard liberal societies against the slippery slope into totalitarianism. Now, obviously, that's crazy, even if it's true that the Soviets made a lot of claims on science. It was junk science a lot of the time. But she incarnated the kind of mood of a whole era. Even Berlin, who, didn't go in for religion, said, what's happened to liberalism? It used to be secular, and that's been pulverized in the name of this new religiosity through which liberals are kind of hugging, the religious whom they used to, treat as their worst enemy.
I mean, there does seem to be like, I can understand how he was a little bit sort of surprised by this, because he's sitting there saying that we should not be constrained, but he maybe wasn't specific enough in saying by whom. Like, she's saying, you're right, we should not be constrained by the state because we're constrained by God. Right, and God should just be a vehicle of the state. Correct. In that sense. Was her agenda different, do you think, than, let's say, like Berlin's, in the sense that was hers in service of protecting capital in a way that maybe like others weren't?
Very soon it was. I mean, in fairness, we have to note that, she what she was really doing in the 40s is, as I narrate at length, is like reviving this 19th century Catholic liberal named Lord Acton. And she actually resisted Friedrich Hayek's appropriation of Acton. He had originally wanted to call the Montpellier Society the Acton Society, and didn't, because he couldn't name it after a Catholic. But she was kind of in the resistance against Hayek too, just like Berlin, but low key. And within a few short years, she's rejected that early kind of resistance and really embraced neoliberalism alongside neoconservatism. And she's like offered the classic arguments about how in the Reagan Revolution we would return to Victorian Christian morality, because what would happen is the state would allow free markets. That was its role, and families would guarantee morality. The state couldn't help families stay together, especially African American families, through money. It would take kind of culture and religion to do that work. And so she became immensely influential in kind of giving a kind of theory that allowed neoliberalism to triumph in fact by attacking the state and saying families would do the job instead. Hannah Arendt, how does she fit into this in terms of like what? Because really what you're describing is sort of almost like, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are pillars that undergird this idea of liberalism as an emancipatory sort of machine, if you will, and the idea of the state functioning
the liberal idea of the state is to function to be emancipatory. And you're talking about the thinkers who undercut the foundations of that idea. Where does Hannah Arendt fit into that?
So she's not a liberal, but I think, I think it turns out when we look at her closely, she's kind of a fellow traveler, if you will, of the Cold War liberals. And she, hammers some of the same ideas that they do. First of all, she's obviously one of the most famous theoretician of so-called totalitarianism, and kind of makes that a famous and plausible notion to a lot of people. But she also rejects the kind of historicism and futurism that had been so central to liberalism, kind of cutting off its foundations. She tried to, unlike the Cold War liberals, to offer something in its stead, but it was not something she was willing to connect to economics. And so famously, she attacks the whole idea of thinking of economics as irrelevant to what politics and political institutions should achieve. Finally, she's in there because she's very open in a way the Cold War liberals were not always, about locating kind of freedom against the state within the transatlantic West, and not seeing emancipation as something that should be a worldwide phenomenon. And I think she interacts in interesting ways with like the fact that Cold War liberals really were talking about a Cold War freedom for a white transatlantic world, and kind of gave up in the very era of decolonization, the most emancipatory event in world history, on the globe as a setting for freedom and equality.
You note that she sort of ignored the Haitian Revolution, which was a pretty, as far as like decolonization goes. Right. That was one of the biggest projects. I mean, France still managed to make them pay for the next.
Worse than that, she, when it came to the decolonization of her own time, she basically said, well, poor people can't have a successful revolution, so why bother, pinning any hopes on what's happening in the mid 20th century when the number of states quadruples.
It really is amazing what World War II, and particularly like sort of the Holocaust, did to the way that people thought and conceived of the way of what the potential of humanity is.
I think that's true. Although,
I guess on both ends.
Yeah, I totally think that's true. And again, there's a Jewish angle, because these are mostly people aren't for a shorter time who are willing to countenance nationalism and even violence in Israel, in the foundation of it, in the self-protection of it, but they don't see those as viable projects for the world's peoples. And so this is, I think, a very considerable kind of defeatist posture for anyone who's supposed to be standing for emancipation.
So lastly, you write about Lionel Trilling, and where does he fit into this, this sort of undercutting, I guess, of what liberalism had been?
So, I mean, the kind of script of the book is to say liberals gave up on their old sources, like the French Revolution and like Hegel and even Marx, and subbed in new gurus. Acton tells us that we're sinful creatures. Lionel Trilling makes Sigmund Freud the canonical liberal, because Freud said in the latter half of his career that humans are aggressive and nothing can change that fact, and they need to be policed so that their aggression doesn't get out of hand. Well, that's just another version of this Cold War defeatism. Trilling had been a fellow traveler on the left in the 1930s and kind of was traumatized by the experience of discovering what the Soviet Union really was. He never gave up on his emancipatory hopes, and I try to show through reading his novel that he also wrote as a literary critic at Columbia University by day, that he was very conflicted about Cold War liberalism. But by making Freud the kind of, master thinker of Cold War liberalism, he basically said, don't dream big. If you do, you're likely to cause too much damage, much as the other Cold War liberals were arguing.
So the idea is that this sort of era of thought that has really bled into, right? I mean, I guess the 40 or 50 years of this degradation of the foundation of liberalism leads us to sort of a neoliberal era that really, I guess, starts in the 80s. And you can hear it through Bill Clinton when he says the era of big government is over, completely sort of negating the idea that government is in a position to help liberate people from their constraints and could in some way help people fulfill. I mean, it feels like on a day we watch Mitch McConnell, freeze. And there's a story in the Times today about Dianne Feinstein. There's a huge fight over her $1 billion fortune or whatever it is, and she can't engage in it because she's barely there. And Joe Biden, 80 years old. Like, we still are living on the tail end of this era that is coming to an end. What is, like, where are we in that arc? At least, I could see it in terms of like the age of people who came about in that era.
Right.
And they're still, it feels like the last chapter of their political influence. But in terms of the idea, where is that idea?
So I totally agree with you. The Cold War called and wants all of our politicians back, mainly the leaders of the Democratic Party, who are all, conceived of their central beliefs in the Cold War. Joe Biden, whom you didn't mention, not least. So, and yet they eventually have to leave the stage, some sooner than others. McConnell very soon, very likely. But the Cold War politics, I think, also deserves to be relegated to the Cold War. And yet it's had this immense afterlife. It was really only challenged fundamentally, I think, in the 1960s when actually the left coined the phrase Cold War liberalism. But it's had so many defenders since, people seeking new successor enemies like terrorists abroad and later at home. And liberals most concerned about safeguarding the continuity of government and finding threats to it rather than offering a new deal for America or wherever. And I think there was a bright spot with Bernie Sanders' candidacy, and we don't know what the potential is for a liberalism like his that connects with socialist traditions, that offers emancipation to Americans and gives them something to believe in. We don't know when that's going to materialize, but it's now or never, I'd say.
Did I just get kicked from the call?
I still hear you. So.
Yeah, Sam's camera.
Bear with me 1 second. I'll be right
worries.
back. That was weird. I just got my video just got kicked from the call. Are we back? There we go. Okay.
Yeah, I see you.
So, tell me, the 60s feels like it was a little bit of an accelerant because in growing up, it felt like, the politics of the 90s was very much it was almost like a blowback from the 60s. And what happened there? I mean, it seemed to be like an accelerant for that idea of like this naivete, and it leads nowhere, and it's circular, and that's sort of like Jerry Rubin heads off in a direction where he's like, we've got to be, by mid 80s, I think Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman were doing like a traveling debate between Yippie and Yuppie. Was happening when I was in college, I believe, and it was, or maybe it was after that, but it was weird. I don't know how else to articulate that, but that seemed like an accelerant.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, you know, the reason the crisis for Cold War liberalism happened in the 60s is that, you know, things that Cold War liberals supported or planned, like the Vietnam War, just went south. And plus there was this unprecedented generational conflict, which, you know, helped take, you know, the resistance to Cold War liberalism ultimately in a kind of cultural direction. The Democrats, after the 1960s, succeeded in reinstating Cold War liberalism. They reject George McGovern's peace candidacy because he loses so badly. They say, you know, America has to fight for freedom. Above all, as we've discussed, the Democrats, while joining some of the cultural liberationist tendencies of the 1960s, lean hard into economic neoliberalism. And their politicians do as much as the Republicans to institutionalize it for our time. When I was young in the 90s, the New Republic magazine, you know, the so-called in-flight magazine of Air Force One, really stood for, you know, worshiping at the tombs of all these Cold War liberals and saying, well, look, they were right. We won we beat the Soviet Union, and they must have been right about something. And they didn't take the opportunity to reimagine liberalism after the Cold War, going back to its emancipatory and even socialist possibilities. And you know, the results are Donald Trump and you know, Joe Biden as the sole alternative if he can pose one.
So now we're going to get into an area that's a little bit outside your portfolio, and to wrap things up a little bit, which is the rise of Bernie Sanders, everything that happens after Occupy. I mean, ideas can outlive the people who promulgate them, but it's harder. It's hard for them to live without the sort of, like, you know, people reiterating it, and it's hard for people to reiterate it, particularly when I think like those ideas in particular were so era specific.
Yes.
To what, you know, a world war is a big deal. Everybody goes through that. And what do you see? Do you see some analog, at least in terms of what these writers did to liberalism, writing today and influencing? Can you see those ideas, not necessarily in retrospect, but maybe I'm asking you to sort of forecast, but
yeah, sure.
What intellectual movements do you see that are happening that at least give you a sense of what possibilities could exist 50 years from now?
Well, you know, at first blush, it seems like good times for Cold War liberals, because exactly where they were concerned about in the 1940s when China fell and when Eastern Europe, you know, went communist, are the places where liberals are, you know, confronting their enemies today. You know, Trump started a new Cold War with China, and the Democrats, including, you know, Biden, have generally followed suit. And of course, Vladimir Putin gave the Cold War liberals a gift by, let's say, impersonating a bit the Soviet threat in the past, even though the current Russia doesn't hold a candle in power to what the Soviet Union had once been. And so the Ukraine war has like saved a lot of Cold War liberals from doubts they were experiencing about their credibility. But
well, I mean, NATO's got 2 new members as of you know, in the past 2 years.
So it seems like, again, it's going gangbusters. And you find in response to Trump, the standard response to Trump is a Cold War liberal one. We have to preserve our democracy. Let's leave out what that means other than prosecuting him and his you know, his henchmen. It's not as if it requires reimagining democracy. And yet, I just think, you know, young people especially reject all of this. And they see, especially with the environmental crisis, that you can't postpone structural renovation really on the world stage. And liberalism, if it's going to survive, has to take on a much more ambitious form. So I'm very hopeful. And this book is really just about kind of seeing how liberals went wrong so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, although I believe many will be tempted to do so for a long time.
What if those external enemies still exist that sort of fed Cold War liberalism? What do they perceive? I feel like they have a less animated sense of domestic ones, because I mean, Donald Trump's a pretty obvious sort of like domestic enemy to Cold War liberalism, and I would argue to like liberalism, broadly speaking. But the point is that's not enough for liberalism to return to its roots. But also, I also don't see Democrats as threatened by. I mean, we saw it a little bit with like, the crime rhetoric. That to me seemed like we're nervous about what happened with George Floyd a little bit, and the easiest way for us to articulate is like, we don't want to hear this, defund the cops type of situation.
Right. Right.
But what else? I mean, like it seems far and few between. Like the blue dogs don't seem to be out there. And just read a piece in the Washington Post that said, Democrats want Biden to be, or some, more aggressive in offering material benefit for people.
Sure.
And, do we still have any vestiges of that, or they've all...
I think there's, a mismatch between the Democrats and their constituents, because, the polls all show what the American people want, and actually what it would take to recruit enough of those who voted for Donald Trump to forge a big supermajority, because we know that's what you need in this country to make policy, given, the filibuster, the Supreme Court. And yet, Biden, as a relic of the Cold War, I think has not been the leader who can kind of, dream big enough to craft that supermajority. It's there for the taking. That's not to say there aren't intricate policy difficulties, but it is to say that, if we can survive this next year of, the two, old men representing the past fighting each other, and then there's going to have to be a contest for the future of the Democratic Party, and it will have to be one that's ultimately a contest over whether to keep or, Cold War liberalism around another generation, or, find something better.
Samuel Moyn, the book is Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times. Really appreciate your time on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
Really fascinating stuff.
Really appreciate it.
All right, folks. That that concludes the free part of our show.
There you go.
I am going to have to run, not because I'm afraid of being around Brandon Sutton and Matt Binder, although I can't tell the difference between Matt and Matt. It's a real problem for a lot of people.
We had two Sams, and then we're gonna have two Matts.
Yeah.
Brandon and Bradley.
Brandon, Matt, guys, I just wanted to say hello. Long time no see, Matt. Happy birthday recently. I know that, and hope the kids are well. And Brandon, hope you're doing well. Love your new backdrop. And wait, are these guys on? Yeah. Oh, we're working up the. All right, I'm just talking, but people can hear them, right? Yeah. Okay. I didn't want to make it like I was talking to myself. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to hand over the program to you. I will be.
What's going on here?
Tiny Matt Binder will be here with us.
Episode. I hear that a lot in my life throughout the years.
There we go.
Yeah.
Little tiny insert, Matt Binder.
Right.
Wait,
Yeah,
what is going on?
Yeah.
I'm working on the crop as we speak.
Okay.
So that's good.
Well,
That's some live
just a
OBS
reminder
going on.
to folks, your support makes this show possible. You can become members at jointhemajority.report.com. Bradley, ESVN.
Yes, we had a great show on Monday. We looked over the division winner odds for each NFL division in the AFC and NFC. Had Dan Schneier, fantasy football writer over at CBS Sports, to discuss some tips ahead of people's drafts, and discussed also some of the controversy surrounding the Women's World Cup and the Spanish Football Federation there. YouTube.com/ESVN show for more.
Matt Leck.
Nick Marcel of Debt Collective talking about the student loan debt stuff for patrons. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning this weekend.
And Matt Binder, do you want to plug something on this half of the show?
Sure. So on the live stream this week at doomedcast.com and youtube.com/Matt Binder, Amanda Moore came on the show to discuss her recent piece in The Nation, detailing how she's been going undercover in various far-right groups and events over the past couple of years, everything from her time attending Turning Point USA events to far-right white supremacist group events. And that's certainly a very interesting one, so go check that out.
Are we doomed?
A lot of these guys are now working,
as
for staffers, and I did like that. A lot of these guys are working as staffers now for congressional, members, or they're working for governments overseas. A lot of Hungary connections here. Definitely go check out the interview. It's fun, but it's also, like you said, a doomed future, I guess.
Oh, great. Brandon, you have anything a little more upbeat to talk about?
Well, yeah, we should have a not so down. Well, I mean, it's about America, so maybe I can't make any promises, but we should have an episode out for all of the discourse maniacs out there on SoundCloud this weekend as well. So you should have a full schedule of podcasts to keep you busy.
All right, great. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Matt and Brandon, Bradley and Matt, we'll take the show forward, and I'll be back tomorrow. Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
I think I might be